There you go. There you go. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's try again. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, blessed be the name. Yeah, it's good to see you all here. My name is Travis Stimeling. I am, among many other things, coordinator of the Appalachian Studies minor and the Appalachian Music minor here at WVU. And I'm very excited to introduce our guest today and to be here to help kick off the launch of a book that has been in the making for a while and that promises to change discussions about who we are on this campus, who we are in this state, and who we are in this region. The book, of course, is Rosemary Hathaway's excellent book, Mountaineers Are Always Free, Heritage, Dissent, and a West Virginia Icon. If you're looking for a history of the Mountaineer, this is not the book for you. If you're looking for a history of how the Mountaineer has functioned as a symbol, as a persona, as a character on this campus, in our state, and in our region, this is the book. If you're looking for deep archival research, understanding the role that the Mountaineers played in our community, this is the book for you. If you are looking for pictures of buildings turned into hillbillies, this is the book for you. It really is just a marvelous book, and I'm so excited that we're here to kick this off today. Obviously, many of you are friends and fans of Rosemary Hathaway. She doesn't need much introduction to this crowd, but anyway, I will tell you what I think you need to know about her. Of course, she is an associate professor of English over in the English department of the Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. She is our resident folklorist on this campus, and a real marvel of a folklorist at that. I'm going to brag on you a bit. I've had the benefit of visiting her class and seeing how engaged her students are in understanding the ways that folk processes work and understanding the myriad ways that we use folk culture in our daily lives and we contribute to it. She's a top-notch researcher and a hell of a teacher and a great colleague as well. We're really lucky to have Rosemary on this campus. This book is worth your time and worth your energy, and I'm going to let Rosemary do some reading. Please give a big round of applause for Rosemary Hathaway.
All right. Wow, thank you. That's a lot to live up to. I'll do my best. All right, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate your coming out on a Monday afternoon to help us celebrate this book, which I thought for a while might never get finished, but it finally did. I'm going to read actually from part of the final chapter of the book. The book kind of is organized chronologically, and each of the chapters sort of looks at a different moment in the history of the Mountaineer when there was some debate about who the Mountaineer is, what the Mountaineer represented, what Mountaineers should look like and do. And the last chapter is kind of pushing that into the present and talking about the ways in which we're kind of thinking about the Mountaineer now. And I decided to read from this part because it also refers back to some of the earlier sections. So, and it talks about everybody's favorite topic of couch burning too. So we'll get to that. Right. In February 2015, the university launched a new public relations and branding campaign whose signature slogan is, you all know this, Mountaineers Go First. In a letter to the university community announcing the new campaign, WVU President Gordon Gee urged people to, quote, take time to think about what it means to you to be a Mountaineer. The new campaign seems to have been launched in part to combat WVU's growing reputation as a party school. In 2007, WVU topped the Princeton Review's list of party schools, and in 2013, it topped Playboy magazine's list. During the period between and shortly after the two list-topping years, WVU witnessed several riots that tested the administration's and law enforcement's tolerance of student tradition. The circumstances surrounding these riots varied widely. The first notable event took place after Osama bin Laden was killed in May 2011, when WVU students took to the streets to celebrate. The celebration, which took place during spring semester's finals week when students were in need of some stress release, escalated to include 22 intentionally set fires. In March 2012, St. Patrick's Day celebrations got out of hand, in part because the YouTube channel I'm Schmacked was on campus to film the events. But the two events that really seemed to test the university's tolerance were the riots that took place after major football wins over the University of Texas in October 2012 and over Baylor in October 2014. I use the term riot to describe these events with some trepidation, as it's a loaded word. The summer of 2017 marked the 50th anniversary of urban uprisings in cities like Detroit and Newark, New Jersey. While both events were labeled as riots at the time, 50 years on, the word riot had become so freighted with racist baggage that other labels were used to describe what had happened there. They were uprisings, rebellions, demonstrations, or simply unrest. Since 1967, the term riot itself has become racially charged, associated primarily with people of color. Calling something a riot is a way to demonize participants and discount their legitimate concerns. For example, after Michael Brown, a young unarmed African-American man, was fatally shot by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014, the Black community there and other places around the country took to the streets to demonstrate against police brutality. When some of these events turned violent, often due to provocation by the police, they were labeled as riots, thus delegitimizing their purpose. Obviously, students whose post-game celebrations led to wanton destruction of property in 2012 and 2014 weren't engaging in that activity to make a political point or to express some kind of grievance. These events were a far cry from the post-Kent State protests that took place at WVU in May 1970. Sorry. These are not slightly out of order. This is in another chapter of the book. Another time when police in riot gear tear-gassed students. The 2014 riot following the WVU football team's win over Baylor was particularly destructive, causing about $45,000 in damage, and the university cracked down hard, expelling 3 students and demanding a culture change on campus. In a strongly worded and lengthy statement following the Baylor riot, President Gee denounced the actions of, quote, a minority of students who diverted the attention from the team's achievement to inexcusable and lawless actions, vowing zero tolerance for this type of criminal and unruly behavior. Most notably, Gee declared that, quote, this is not how Mountaineers behave. Or is it? In a newspaper article about the 2014 riots, Morgantown Fire Chief Mark Caravassos commented that on one level, such events had always been part of college culture, noting that the fire department records documented a riot after a WVU football win over Princeton in 1919. I'll go back to this. In this instance, students apparently burned down the University Observatory. And to be sure, pranking and other sorts of rowdy liminal behavior have been part of college culture from the beginning. As a folklorist, I was fascinated by the debate about tradition that erupted after the October 2014 riot. I was teaching our American folklore and culture class at the time, and when I discussed the events with students, they were divided about whether such activities were traditional and whether labeling something as tradition excuses what would, in other contexts, be considered violent or criminal behavior. Recall that WVU's 2014 riot took place very shortly after the events in Ferguson, Missouri. Students here were outraged at having been tear-gassed by police and felt themselves to be victims of police brutality. In the context of what was happening in Ferguson and other locations around the country where sister protests had popped up, I had very little sympathy with their feeling, frankly. But the larger question, whether rioting was or should be considered a traditional part of WVU culture, was a more compelling and ambiguous concern. One aspect of that traditional culture that particularly came under scrutiny between 2007 and 2014 was that of couch burning. Somehow, students had become convinced that this was a tradition unique to WVU, although incidents of couch burning were numerous at other universities. In fact, the city of Boulder, Colorado had banned upholstered furniture on porches in 2002 after one too many incidents of couch burning by students at the University of Colorado. A New York Times article about Boulder's ordinance says that it came in response to more than 100 couch burnings between 1996 and 2002, and that the city's new ruling mirrored laws in other campus towns. So couch burning may have become a broader college tradition in the mid-1990s, but it was certainly never one that was unique to WVU. Nevertheless, the belief that couch burning is a central WVU tradition has been widely accepted and even embraced. After students burned couches to celebrate the death of Osama bin Laden, the university and the city of Morgantown started cracking down on intentional fire setting. This crackdown, in turn, inspired students to push back, starting a Facebook group called WVU Couch Burning, Save the Tradition by Making It a University Event, which argued exactly that the university should make couch burning official and monitor the event. A Daily Athenaeum editorial published in November 2011 supported this idea, arguing that a sanctioned burning, quote, would show the rebellious Montani Semper Liberi spirit that defines Appalachia, but within a more modern and safety-conscious framework. It would also serve to rid the tradition of its hillbilly connotations by, quote, taking a blemish on our university and turning it into a unique characteristic that can safely be added into the fabric of our campus's culture. But it's not only students who regard couch burning as a tradition. Businesses in the community certainly support the notion by creating merchandise that celebrates it as such. For a few years, this is a bonus picture, this one isn't in the book, the Kroger Bakery at Morgantown's Suncrest Town Center made and sold couch burning cakes during football season. These confections were constructed and iced to look like couches and came complete with candles, so that you could set your own sugary couch on fire and eat it too. T-shirts available in stores around town repeatedly reference the practice, right, such as one that read, where greatness is learned and couches are burned, and this more recent example claiming that Saturdays are for burning couches. After the Texas football win in 2012, a Daily Athenaeum article asked, is the practice of burning couches really a tradition? The article quotes Morgantown Fire Marshal Ken Tennant as saying that fires are, quote, almost like folklore. People hear stories from their parents when they were here or from other fraternity members. Rioting and retaliating against police and firefighters at the scene is an even more recent part of this tradition. As Tennant put it, quote, if you're celebrating a victory, how does that turn into picking up a rock and throwing it at a firefighter or a police officer? I can't make that connection. For some students, however, even rioting and throwing things at the police have become deeply traditional and cherished college experiences. The very title of the DA's article, For Better or Worse, Mountaineers Go Hard, says everything about contemporary notions of Mountaineer identity. A real WVU Mountaineer is all in, regardless of the consequences. It's difficult to argue with that interpretation of what it means to be a WVU Mountaineer. In some ways, students rioting and burning couches is exactly the kind of anti-establishment behavior we've come to expect of the Mountaineer. Is it really all that different from the out-of-control thews or pep rally that was the first Mountaineer Day in 1947? Which is the less criminal act, destroying private property during a riot or stealing government property for the purposes of making a homecoming decoration, as the men of Trinity Hall did when they took pipe from the U.S. Bureau of Mines? And these are also things that are discussed earlier in the book. In many ways, the administration's response to the October 2014 riot was not dissimilar from the response that followed the first Mountaineer Day in 1947. English professor James Bronner's thin veneer of civilization had once again been eroded, and students violated the boundary between harmless fun and incivility. This boundary was again tested in early 2019. As you might recall, in the last few days of January, the east coast of the U.S. experienced a polar vortex, an Arctic blast that brought sub-zero temperatures to Morgantown and closed the WVU campus for 3 days. While the initial 2 days were frigid but sunny, Friday brought slightly warmer temperatures and about 6 inches of snow. After days of being cooped up inside, students relished a real snow day. At the top of Spruce Street, also not in the book, several hundred students began sledding, snowboarding, and drinking. In the mid-afternoon, a city snowplow came along to clear the street. Students objected strenuously, blocking the road, and the conflict escalated to the point where a few students were throwing rocks and bottles at the police. The police, in turn, tried to break up the gathering with sonic blasts, pepper balls, and smoke grenades. Sure enough, by the time the local news aired that evening, WVU again was in the spotlight for a student riot. The Daily Athenaeum, however, as you can see at the top, titled its story about the event, The Battle of Spruce Street, which I think kind of gets at the frontiersman Mountaineer thing. The conflict between the rioting hillbilly Mountaineer and the beleaguered, embattled frontiersman Mountaineer was reignited. As it had after previous riots, the university again called on students to behave in ways that, quote, represent our Mountaineer values. But how those Mountaineer values are defined depends on who you ask to describe them. For some students in 2019, as in 1947's first Mountaineer Day, those values include rowdy behavior and drunkenness. Mountaineers who go hard are real Mountaineers. Everyone else is failing at Mountaineer identity. After the Baylor riot, President Gee seemed to imply that it was this false equivalent, the idea that being a mountaineer means to go hard, regardless of consequences, that needed to be challenged, as reflected in his insistence that this was not how mountaineers behaved. The Go First branding campaign, already in development before the 2014 Baylor victory riot, coincided nicely with the administration's commitment to changing campus culture, while also urging students to go first in more academic and productive ways. Just as the university had consciously remade the WVU Mountaineers image over in the 1950s, outlawing the hillbilly and institutionalizing the frontiersman, it stepped in after the riots and exercised another top-down makeover with the Mountaineers Go First campaign, which was launched just a few months later. The Go First campaign preserves the Mountaineers' innate qualities, a pioneering spirit, resilience, generosity, and fearlessness, while disconnecting those qualities from any particular kind of body. In other words, the campaign extends Mountaineer characteristics to the whole student body, not just white males. The campaign capitalizes on the mythology of the frontiersman mountaineer while erasing the man on the frontier. One of the ways it accomplishes this is by repackaging the rebellious aspects of the mountaineer's identity into more positive and productive qualities. The university's Brand Center website explicitly defines and limits these qualities as 6 personality traits, and those are the ones that are here. Pioneering, passionate, innovative, tireless, grounded, and caring. Right. The page notes that these traits, quote, drive the voice and image of our entire brand. Above all, the Brand Center encourages consistency in its portrayal of mountaineer identity. But as we have seen again and again, only part of mountaineer behavior or identity is tied up in the noble pioneering spirit that the Go First campaign tries to capture. The other part is allied with the other side of the mountaineer family tree, that of the rebellious squatter or hillbilly. Repeatedly, we have seen that you can't have one without the other, despite the university's efforts, past and present, to control the uncontrolled and uncontrollable aspects of the figure. The Go First campaign may have the power to officially define who and what the WVU Mountaineer is, but it cannot quash the impulse and really the right of the university community to interpret the figure in their own ways. A really lovely illustration of this is in this unauthorized, unofficial button produced by students affiliated with the university's LGBTQ+ Center, which reads, as you can see, we're here, we're queer, and then it's got the Mountaineer logo. And what I find especially interesting about this is that with the Go First campaign, that Mountaineer logo of the figure with the rifle has actually been sort of prohibited from use. So they're really kind of reappropriating it in a couple of very interesting ways. The students' appropriation of the image is totally in keeping with the long tradition of reinterpreting and extending Mountaineer identity to make it fit those who have been perceived as outside its parameters. The button plays with the Mountaineer image in ways similar to the ways Trinity Hall's motley crew of first-generation college students from immigrant communities played with the Mountaineer image in the late 1940s, and for similar purposes, to claim Mountaineer identity for themselves. Pairing of the Mountaineer logo with a revised version of ACT UP's slogan, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," the button simultaneously expands the Mountaineer's identity to include the LGBTQ+ community and queers the Mountaineer. The button reminds us again that the informal, student-driven image of the WVU Mountaineer and the university's official ideas about the figure can coexist peacefully. But as we have seen at other moments, the disconnect between those two visions of the WVU Mountaineers widened, creating conflicts that ended with the university reasserting its authority over the Mountaineers' image. Whether these efforts will be successful lies in understanding that the frontiersman Mountaineer and the hillbilly Mountaineer cannot be extricated. Both will find expression one way or another. The language of the Mountaineers Go First brand may encourage students to push past obstacles, but as Gee's statement on the Baylor riot suggests, there are other boundaries that students will not be allowed to cross. Being Mountaineers, though, it's in their nature to try. That's where I'm going to stop. Thank you. Okay.
The Mountaineers Go First campaign reminds me of an anecdote from one of our conference mates at TCU the horned frogs and their branding materials. It says the horned frog is a reptile and should never be displayed in swimming or diving situations. And so fascinating how these things work. So for the next portion of our program, we're going to have a little dialogue here between Rosemary, who you've now met and heard the work of, and Emily Hilliard. For those of you who don't know Emily, Emily is our West Virginia State folklorist, a remarkable treasure in her own right, who's done a lot of really important work helping to challenge the notion that we're all just a bunch of white hillbillies here in West Virginia, and has done some really remarkable work in drawing attention to communities of practice that have not been normally documented by folklorists in previous generations. So we're really lucky to have Emily here. So how about a round of applause for Emily?
Thank you, Travis. And thank you so much, Rosemary. I really love this book. I'm excited to cite it in some of my own work. So why don't you tell us initially about how you came to this subject, and then we'll start with like the couch burning and kind of work our way backwards and explore some of the themes that came up in that chapter.
Okay, great. Is mine is on, isn't it? Yeah, okay. For me, this book began even before I ever arrived in Morgantown, in that both of my parents were West Virginia natives and met at WVU. And so I grew up in Ohio, hearing about the Mountaineers for my whole life. And so I had a very particular idea about what it meant to be a Mountaineer before I came here myself in 2007. And as soon as I arrived, I realized really quickly that the Mountaineer is not like other college mascots, right? That, in fact, a number of the former individuals who served as the WVU Mountaineer told me explicitly when I interviewed them, I was not a mascot. I am not a mascot. A mascot is, a horned frog, for example, right, that runs around with a big foam head. That I am a symbol. I'm a representative of the university and the entire state. But even before I talked to them, that was very clear to me just from what students were telling me, that this had much more to do with kind of a set of values and traits than it did with simply being a West Virginian or being a student or an alumnus of WVU. Mm-hmm. So that kind of opened the garage door, I guess, to start me down this path. And then there were, other things that kind of came up along the way that helped me see that it was even more complex than I thought. I think one of the things that really struck me was a couple years after I got here, in spring 2009, was when Rebecca Durst was named the second female Mountaineer. And I sort of figured students would be really excited about that, and actually they weren't. And I was especially surprised that it was female students in particular who were really unhappy about having a woman Mountaineer and really felt like, women can't be Mountaineers. And that sort of showed me that, okay, there's some really interesting boundaries on this figure too that I need to explore. So that, I think, was the moment when I realized, oh, this is a whole book project. And, yeah, and that's when I went down the rabbit hole. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I like that the initial impetus, though, was family lore in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
Tracks
absolutely.
As a folklorist.
Yes, yeah, and a lot of my dad's stories about being a student at WVU on the GI Bill after the Second World War make up one of the chapters in the book, because that was certainly where I got not only my ideas about WVU and being a Mountaineer, but just about what college was like. I had a really inflated sense that college was kind of all about playing terrible pranks on people and, staying up all night planning these elaborate pranks. So, my own college experience was kind of disappointing. In the
you didn't create any hillbillies out of buildings? Or
no, I did not create hillbillies out of buildings, or move drunken neighbor's entire room out to the front yard, including the lamp so they could light it. Yeah, it was disappointing, but I'm glad I found a use for those family stories anyway.
Right. One of the things I really love about the book is you kind of do it pretty subtly throughout, but you're telling us what it means to be a folklorist and the sort of line of inquiry and the methodology and the approach. So I'm curious, what about your background and training or just inform the way that you tell this story? I think it's different than a historian might approach it, or even an anthropologist might approach it.
Yeah.
So what was kind of your guiding light in how you tell the story?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to say to the historians in the room,
We love them too.
we love them too, and I don't know how they do what they do because doing all of this archival research, I sort of realized, how do you know when to stop? You could just go on forever. I think, and so certainly that was a way in which I felt like what I was doing was very different. I think for me, one of the moments when I really realized that my approach to this as a folklorist was actually beneficial was, so in one of the chapters I kind of talk about the Mountaineer during the kind of anti-war movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I interviewed two men who had been the Mountaineer in back-to-back years, one in 1968-69 and the other in 1969-70. And they both kind of, and I interviewed them separately at different points in time. And the first person I interviewed, told me this story about a protest on campus, which he sort of characterized as a water balloon fight, that it was just sort of as he described it, it was kind of the fraternity, the Greeks against I can't remember what the term he used was, but the nerds basically was the rough translation. And I kind of laughed along with him about this water balloon fight and didn't really think anything of it until I interviewed the second guy who I was interviewing at his home in suburban DC, and he had invited his daughter over to be part of the interview, and she had just graduated from college. And I asked him the same question about what was it like to be the Mountaineer on campus at such a turbulent time. And I figured he'd say the same thing that the other guy had, which was, there wasn't much going on at WVU during that period. It was a pretty quiet campus. But he turned to his daughter and said, "Do you remember this story?" Right, and then turned back to me and proceeded to tell me a story about these these protests that happened after the Kent State shootings in front of the mountain lair that attracted like 1,000 people and basically shut down University Avenue for 3 days. And at the end of those 3 days, the powers that be got irritated about this and sent in the campus police and the city police and the National Guard, right, with, and tear gas the participants. And I sort of thought, wait a minute, this is the same event that the other person was talking about? How does this work? And I guess I use that as an example because for me it was a moment of realizing I'm a folklorist. I just care about the story. I care about the narratives that people tell about these events. I'm not that concerned about proving what was true or not true, right? Now, I sort of triangulated this and did some additional research, and of course, these things really did happen. But when I went back and talked to the first guy about it, he was like, "What can I tell you? I just really didn't register that." And it was just a reminder to me that the stories people tell are shaped so much by their own beliefs and their own experience, and that those things change radically too over the course of decades. And I really thought, I really felt privileged to come out of a discipline where I didn't feel like I had to resolve those two stories with each other, that actually what made it interesting was holding them up next to each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then as kind of a running theme through the book, where you see all these historical moments where official narrative is kind of bumping up against folk narrative or vernacular narrative.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about some of those moments that you highlight?
Yeah. I think in some ways that's the kind of guiding principle for how the book is organized are these various moments in the state's history and in the university's history when the sort of folk idea of the Mountaineer comes into conflict with the sort of official idea about the Mountaineer. So, I focus on that period after the Second World War and into the 1950s when, as I sort of hinted at in the reading I did, the Daniel Boone craze kind of kicked off, and the university decided, we're just going to go down the Daniel Boone route, right? And we're going to tell the university bookstore that they're not allowed to sell this hillbilly merchandise anymore. And yet, right, the hillbilly portrayals persist in that sense. So I guess I'm always fascinated when things like that happen, that, there's sort of these top-down efforts to manage an image of any kind, because to me that's, as a folklorist, that's always a recipe for disaster. It's never going to work. You can try, and it might work in the short term, but ultimately, and maybe this is what I love about being a folklorist, right? The people win, right? The people's idea about these things almost always triumphs in the end. So I don't know if that really quite answers your question.
Yeah. And I mean, I think returning to the couch burning, there's a moment when you write about the suggestion that the couch burning be made official. And it's sort of, what happens when a carnivalesque liminal event then becomes official? Usually it doesn't work very well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I read that, I'm like, props to you students for, thinking that that's a good way to continue this, but it's never going to work, right? I mean, even if the university were to sanction that and sort of, organize it and, put boundaries on it, the very fact that the university is doing that is going to encourage people to, to rebel and do their own thing. That's just kind of the way culture works. So, it's sort of an interesting thought. But again, as you say, when the whole point is that you're supposed to be sort of transgressing everyday boundaries, making it a kind of official everyday event, is either going to kill it or ensure that it's just going to come back, 10 times stronger than ever.
So let's get into the duality of the Mountaineer across time. So you say that it was both cultural hero and trickster, and that's kind of part of the tension. And then also the hillbilly and the frontiersman. So maybe kind of going to the first part of the book, where do you see those paths kind of coming together and then diverging?
Yeah. It's really complicated, I think, the ways in which, I mean, that was honestly the part of the process of writing this that I struggled the most with, was sort of, looking at that early history and trying to figure out what is happening here. Because there are definitely moments, I think, where that trickster and culture hero figure had already been intertwined. I think particularly, I mean, Davy Crockett, for example, is a good example. He was both sort of a heroic figure, but also this kind of country bumpkin, jokey figure. And to me, that's sort of where the connection between those two things begins, and where you first kind of begin to see the ways in which people both inside and outside a culture try to latch on to different aspects of the same figure to promote their own ends. But as I talk about in that first chapter, I think the roots of that go back even further, all the way back to, the idea of Lubberland and, other things from early British literature. So it's a long tradition.
But yeah, I was kind of surprised to find that it was, hillbilly was a ubiquitous figure by 1930 or earlier.
Yeah. And that was really surprising to me too, because I guess I sort of, and just the way the meaning of that word changed so quickly right? That, when in its first appearance, it referred specifically to somebody from Arkansas, but, almost immediately it extended to kind of anybody from any sort of, uh, hilly terrain east of the Mississippi. And then, and then kind of gets appropriated as as the name for a whole musical genre, and
Which was inherently racialized.
yes, exactly, which was used to kind of distinguish this is white music versus race music, or what any of the other kind of coded names that got used to describe African American music at the time. Yeah.
And I also thought it was curious that the Little Abner comic strip came out the same year, I think, as the university decided to adopt the Mountaineer as a mascot.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think Lil Abner and I'm blanking right now on the name of the comic strip that Snuffy Smith first appeared in, was Arnie Google, right? And Paul Webb's Mountain Boys all came out in the same year, and it was the same year that the university kind of officialized the Mountaineer as a mascot. And it's hard not to imagine that they didn't go with Mountaineer specifically to kind of counter that emerging, sort of pop culture figure of the hillbilly.
Right. So there's two moments that you write about where the Mountaineer's firearm has kind of come into question. And again, you see the duality between is the Mountaineer a figure that makes us long for the frontier past, or does the Mountaineer represent the tumult of today? So one was in, I think 71 is when the statue was put in, but West Virginia being the state with the highest number of Vietnam soldiers per capita.
Right.
And so like 60% of the student body coming in were veterans, and in the midst of anti-war sentiment and protest. So that was one moment, and the university decides to, or maybe doesn't even question that the Mountaineer would have a gun. And you speak about the irony of that. And then again in the campus carry proposal last year, when the Mountaineer was kind of, I think on official websites, mentioned that it's the one person who can carry on campus.
Yeah, exactly.
I would love to hear a little bit more about that, especially for people who haven't read the book, just to kind of tease those parts.
Yeah. I found that really interesting too, because while contemporarily we, conceive of the musket as being an absolute, must-have part of the Mountaineers' kit, it wasn't always, right? They didn't always carry the musket. And even once they did start carrying the musket, it was sort of on again, off again, right? And in fact, from what I understand, after one of the Mountaineers accidentally shot his finger off during a football game in the late 1960s, they were prohibited from carrying the musket until I think they moved over to the new stadium. So I think it's really interesting that item that we imagine is absolutely essential hasn't always been essential. But I was really intrigued too, and this was just as I was finishing writing the book last spring, and I thought, well, okay, now we gotta ask for an extension, because I gotta put this in here that, that the university's frequently asked question sheet about the campus carry thing listed all the people who were currently allowed to carry firearms on campus, and it listed, police officers and, people in the military and so on and so forth. And then the last person listed was the Mountaineer, which is kind of startling. And I think there were some of us who thought, well, if students had to carry, muzzle loading muskets, then maybe I'd be okay with that, because it would probably take anybody 5 minutes to get that set up to shoot, and give you plenty of time to get out of the room. But it was really, on a much more serious note, it was really interesting to me how the fact that the Mountaineer carries a gun, and how the state motto, Montana Semper Liberi, got used on both sides of that debate, right? That the West Virginia Citizens Defense League, in a lot of its pro-campus carry materials, referred explicitly to the state motto, right? And said, Mountaineers are always free, and that means you're free to carry a gun wherever you want. And yet that same, the fact that the Mountaineer carries a musket and the state motto got used to oppose campus carry too. And to me, that really indicates, how deeply, again, West Virginians identify with both the state motto and with the figure of the Mountaineer, and again, in these really complex ways that we will never be able to agree on.
Right. Jumping ahead a little to after the Go First campaign, I think this is in the last chapter of the book, or maybe a little bit after the part that you read. You write about how now in the kind of the second phase of the Go First campaign, the Mountaineer has been re-embodied in a sense into these, unlikely Mountaineers, or unlikely bodies of the Mountaineer, with the campaign that has, immigrant students, listing their traits and, where they're from and the languages they speak, and then, that they're a high achieving student, and then Mountaineer. So could you talk a little bit, and I think definitely with the chapter on the women Mountaineers, about how the embodiment of the Mountaineer as a person has been problematic in different ways over the history of the mascot or the icon.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I don't think that it ever was a problem, or at least not consciously, right? That people hadn't perceived that as a problem until Natalie Tennant became the first woman Mountaineer. And there was and she just got an unbelievable amount of harassment about that. And I think that's when people, and in the other direction, people were saying, well, there were plenty of frontiers women, right? Who, none of us would be here if it were not for them, for the Betty Zanes and, other frontier women who came before us. And so I think that was kind of the first moment when we sort of realized that the body of the Mountaineer was problematic. And I really do think that in part of the university's the Go First campaign, they did a sort of survey of, people, or they didn't do it, the marketing firm that they hired did, to sort of see what people's reactions were to both the Flying WV logo and then the Mountaineer logo. And people recognized the Flying WV logo, had really positive associations with it, but not so positive associations with the Mountaineer figure, right? Because, people said, it sort of implies that only, white men who look like this can be the Mountaineer. And it was really fascinating to me that the university's response to that was just to systematically kind of begin removing that logo, and going to this purely rhetorical kind of notion of who the Mountaineer is. But then, this sort of second wave of applying the label Mountaineer to students of color and students who are, either international students or whose parents immigrated here. And just, literally, I think on Friday, some of you may have seen there was a tweet that came out of the university with this sort of now third wave of the Go First campaign with the hashtag I belong, right? And it's the same sort of, I'm not quite sure what the word I'm looking for is. The impetus, I think, is the same, right? That, it's I'm a Mountaineer, I belong, and then it has, all different kinds of people saying I belong. So it's fascinating to me that they're kind of continuing to move that ball forward.
Yeah, with going back to the women Mountaineers, maybe it's the quotes that you picked out, but I was just struck how nonchalant and cheerful they were. I mean, I think it takes two special women to be able to pull that off.
Yes.
But Rebecca Durst, is that her? Durst? Yeah. Saying, yeah, I mean, people grab me, it's for selfies, and just kind of being like, that's just par for the course. Like, this is part of the job that I signed up for.
Yeah.
Which was, I don't think some of it was the job they signed up for, but,
exactly.
But it was kind of amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think she signed up to be sexually harassed,
Right.
but she was sexually harassed in the job. So, I mean, I think it takes a special person to be the WVU Mountaineer, period, because I couldn't do it. It's so much work. But those two especially, I mean, my interviews with the two of them just kind of blew my mind because they were, as you said, they're both, the stories they told about really the abuse, particularly Natalie Tennant, the abuse that she suffered during her year as the Mountaineer. And yet, it's kind of, I mean, and it's clear that it was hurtful, but just kind of water off a duck's back to her too, She's like, I just figured I had to, take this with a big grain of salt and a real sense of humor. And, and she says it, certainly toughened her up for being in politics.
Right.
maybe that's how they should market it, right? You want to run for politics someday? Be the Mountaineer, or be a woman Mountaineer in particular. You'll everything else will seem easy after that.
We're going to open up to questions, but I just wanted to kind of point out another aspect is, I think obviously we've touched on it a little bit, but just the coding of the Mountaineer and the history of it as a white male figure, and there have been no people of color who have portrayed. I'm not sure, if that would be appealing. But then you also have this part of the book where at the Grace Bible Church in Charleston, there's a mural depicting an African-American Mountaineer over the state capitol.
Yes.
Which I thought was very cool. I haven't seen that.
Yeah. And I have not seen it in person. I really would like to go see that sometime. But yeah, I think there's a definite, there's a history of exclusion in the Mountaineer in ways both explicit and deliberate and conscious, and in more subtle and implicit ways. And that's what I love about that mural, is that it kind of reminds us that, there are a lot of other people out here who identify as Mountaineers, right, but don't look like the way the usual portrayal of the Mountaineer is, comes across to us. So yeah, I would be really interested in that. And I was, sort of looking into, other university mascots that are portrayed by individuals where you can see their face and, all that. And what's interesting is that, the Notre Dame leprechaun, which, is problematic in its own right. But I think they've now had 3 African-American students who have portrayed the Notre Dame leprechaun and 1 international student. So I think, in that way, we have some ground to make up.
And just this morning, the finalists were announced for the next round, right? Three white men and 1 white woman.
Yeah.
So we know that in the next, you're that woman.
Yay!
Oh.
Yay!
So I believe the cheer off, I believe, is on Saturday, correct? Yes.
Yeah.
So go check that out.
Yes.
Awesome.
Well, it's
Awesome.
probably already happened, but prepare for people to ask where your beard is. I'm not. Yep. That's.
I always say I'm still working on it.
Yeah. Good. Yep.
So we do have time for some questions from the floor. If you're interested in asking a question, please step to the microphone so we can all hear you. Don't everyone rush at once. I can wait all day.
We'll look away.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, as you've been talking, I've been thinking about other mascots, and I'm not that familiar with a bunch of them, but are there any others that are, you mentioned the leprechaun where it's a visible face and a personality,
Yeah.
but I'm interested in what you're saying about the embodiment of values.
Yeah.
I mean, the Buckeye, I guess it involves some values, but not in the same way.
Yeah.
And so I was curious if there are any other comparables.
Yeah, that's again what I think is really fascinating about the Mountaineer is that there are certainly other mascots where it's a recognizable individual. You can see their face, like the USC Trojan is another one, and there's several others, but none that again sort of represent this larger identity of people in the whole state, right? I mean, most Big Ten schools, their mascot is kind of related to a state identity, but it's not a particular, it's as you say, a Buckeye or a Hoosier or, it's not a person who is kind of representative of the whole history of the place in the way the WVU Mountaineer is. So in that way, as far as I can tell, it's pretty unique.
I'm curious what you do with the image of the Mountaineer in colonialism.
The image of the Mountaineer.
In colonialism or settler society?
Yeah. That's definitely a big part of that first chapter is kind of looking at the roots of that figure and the ways in which it was always kind of, from the beginning, a kind of romanticized figure. Right, that by the time there is such a person as the frontiersman or the mountaineer, people on the East Coast are already pining for the days of the frontier, right? And I'm talking like in 1810, which we sort of think as the height of the frontier era. People are already sort of romantic about the loss of the frontiersmen and the loss of those frontier values. So I think that's really interesting that it's never not been this sort of nostalgia figure. Yeah.
Well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank our hosts and our sponsors for the event, WVU Press, the WVU Humanities Center, and the Appalachian Justice Initiative. How about a round of applause for our sponsors?
Yes.
And a big round of applause for Emily Hilliard and Rosemary Hathaway, our authors.
And Travis.
Yeah.
And Travis Stimeling.
Should you be so inclined, I believe that Derek Krisoff, the director of the WVU Press, has books for sale. Please go back and purchase a copy. I bet Rosemary would even be happy to sign one for you, should you be so inclined. Thank you all for coming out.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people didn't want to get up and go to the mic for, too.
Great job.
Yeah, awesome.